So in today's episode, Kenji and I are going to talk through a structured approach to decision making in real estate. But this is something you can use in every part of your life to help you make decisions and to see all sides of a potential choice. But what we're gonna do today is use a structured approach to talk through really some specific real estate examples and show you how we would use it to think through the upsides, the downsides, and then also to decide in the end what the right choice is for us. And what we feel very, very passionately about is helping people learn how to fish so that they're self-sufficient. And what I think you'll find is that actually you're already self-sufficient. One thing about doctors and professionals in general is we are trained to really think critically about every decision.
When it comes to real estate, I think one of the things that our students kind of come into our course, they come in and tell us, I'm a complete newbie, right? And okay, so I understand you're new to real estate, right? But one of the things that we're trying to emphasize here is that you're not new to problem solving, right? You're a veteran at problem solving. And that's really what it takes, right? Is to be able to solve these problems. And we'll give you the structured approach to how to solve problems, but it's just applying that problem solving to real estate. And again, you'll be able to solve any of these problems.
What are the upsides? What are the downsides? And can I live with the downsides? And then we added a little bit of a complexity to that because we also not only wanted to think about what are the upsides, but we wanted to think through how can we make those more likely to occur? Are there things there are actions we can take to help support some of those upsides the potential upsides to become a reality? And same with the downsides. When you're asking yourself, what are the downsides? Well, is there anything you can do today to mitigate the risk of some of those downsides occurring? And that's something actually probably one of our major focuses in real estate is whenever we're looking at deals, we're thinking about the downsides and then we're going and taking the action to mitigate those, to make them less likely usually by getting more information is how we do it.
Yeah, and I'll give you an example. Some of our students will invest in, let's say, short-term rentals, right? And they'll invest in something that works really amazing as a short-term rental. The numbers check out, really good cash flow. But the downside, if you think, so everybody's thinking about the upside, the cash flow, right? Okay. But the downsides, right? What are the downsides? One downside is there may be a regulation change, right? And all of a sudden you can't rent your short-term rental out as a short-term rental, right? And so what if that happens, right? What are some things that you can do to mitigate that downside? Well, one of the things that you can do to mitigate the downside is to think about, okay, if I can't use this as a short-term rental and I convert this to a long-term rental, how do the numbers work, right? And and what you want to do is then ultimately you can do that. You can think through that on the day that or before you buy that short-term rental. And if you think through that beforehand, then what you may end up doing is choosing properties that work both as a short-term rental, but also as a long-term rental. So it still cash flows as a long-term rental. So that's, again, one way to mitigate some of the downsides of that specific investment.
And so let me just broadly talk about upsides for 401k liquidation. So for us, when we thought about should we do this, the upsides for us was we needed more cash to invest in our real estate portfolio. And so that's really what we wanted. That was the upside.
Well, and then part of that upside was that we had the confidence that we could make more money with our rentals than we would with the 401k. So that's also part of that upside.
Yeah. And so for us, the first year that we started investing in real estate, I wouldn't have felt comfortable with that because I wouldn't have been as confident in that upside, right? And so then we thought through the downsides. And for us, there was state income taxes, which luckily we didn't have. Actually, when we came up with this 401k idea, we were living in Hawaii at the time. We actually didn't liquidate our 401ks until we moved back to Washington State and there was no state income tax.
So we mitigated that downside, right? We said, okay, this is the downside. This would be one reason we shouldn't liquidate our 401ks. And the way we mitigated, we said, okay, we're going to wait until we move back to Washington and move out of this high state income tax, state of Hawaii. And then we're going to liquidate it once we move to Washington, where we can completely eliminate that state income tax. So it's no longer a downside. For our students and for anybody thinking about doing this, right? You have to kind of go through this structured approach, right? Think about what is the upside for you, and then think about what are the downsides for you, right? And think about, what state you live in, right? Think about, do you have a plan to shelter that income tax that you're going to be hit with, right? And then what else, do you have the confidence that you can do more with that money than you're going to be doing with that money just sitting in a 401k? So again, everybody's in a unique situation. Everybody has different skill sets in terms of being able to make that investment work, right? So you got to think about all those things when you make those.
So the next example we bring to you is an example that we've had a number of students actually come to us with as well, is that they're going to buy a property, or they're going under contract with a property, and they're going into the inspection period, and the seller says, oh, I have this inspection report. It's actually an inspection report that I paid for, or that maybe the previous person under contract paid for. It's, a month old. Why don't you just use that instead of doing your own inspection? So a lot of students have said, well, what should I do? So number one, thinking through the upsides, right? The upside of using an inspection that's already been paid for and done is you save that inspection cost, right? And you save that time and energy and effort on everyone's part. The downsides, though, are significant when you think through them. So number one is that the home seller may have actually gotten an inspector who was, they were being paid by them, and maybe they did a halfway decent inspection, but they actually missed something. Maybe they weren't actually a rental property inspector, and that wasn't their focus. They were a primary home residence inspector, so they didn't know even what to look for. So there's a lot of potential problems with, with the inspection that you may not see or may not even know about if you just accept it blindly.
Yeah, I think another thing is that you don't really know if that inspector is necessarily on your side. And what I mean by that is that when we go into the negotiation period, right, we're always negotiating. We're always kind of trying to find the angles. And one way you can find those angles for getting a better deal and negotiating a better deal is to have an inspector who's on your team, who is working with you to identify things that you can then counter with the seller on. And you can basically go back to the seller and say, hey, our inspector found all these issues, right? And they estimate that these things are going to cost, whatever it's going to cost. So we're going to need a discount off of what we had offered you originally, because this property is not worth that anymore, right? And so therefore, if you think about it in that context, if you're just inheriting a report, that's not the same as working alongside your inspector and having them uncover issues with the property and have it be as part of your kind of negotiations. Again, completely different situation. And for me, that's a big downside. I would not want to miss that opportunity to work with an inspector who's on my team, who's trying to help me negotiate an even better deal.
Right. For us, when we think through the upsides and the downsides, I'd rather spend, let's say, $800 on an inspection and maintain my negotiating power and make sure there wasn't anything missed. Because when I think through all, the potential downsides, if there was something major missed, like a plumbing issue that was going to cost me $5,000. Like, I'm not willing to accept that downside. And so for us, it's a really clear decision. We'd rather pay for our own inspection and just make sure we maintain those upsides.
All right, so let's talk about another one, another student example. And especially when people come into our course early on, this is a topic that comes up all the time, which is this fear of using debt, right? And getting loans. And I can't imagine going from having just paid my student loans to all of a sudden I have 10 properties with 10 loans, millions of dollars in debt, right? And so I think that's one of the things that a lot of people come into our course with, this fear of having or reaccumulating debt after having just paid off student loans.
Right, and that's where their thinking stops, right?
Right.
Stops in the fear, and then I can't use debt. Debt isn't good. Let's stop there. But let's look at the upsides. of
Right.
using debt, right? And the major upside is leverage. I mean, when you're able to take, $50,000 of your own money and buy a $400,000 property and and use that leverage, all of a sudden you have created such a vehicle for yourself for wealth, because now you're getting all of the upside. So that property, let's say, has some market appreciation, or you force some appreciation on that property, that's all yours. And all the tax benefits with like writing off bonus depreciation, you write it off on the whole $400,000. Well, the property part of the 400,000, not just on the portion that you put down. That leverage is what allows you to grow so quickly. And so if you give up that upside, you're going to grow your portfolio much slower.
All right, well, then let's kind of shift gears to talk about the other situation where a student will come to us and say, check out this amazing deal. Look at the numbers on this thing, right? And and I love this one because it's like, well, okay, and have you thought through, well, you clearly see the upside, right? That's what we call excessive optimism. You clearly see the upsides. Well, let's talk about the downsides, right? And it's funny because it's usually pretty quick for us to identify the downsides. Like for example, this happened recently. I pulled up a crime map. And I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with crime maps, but it was all kind of like, this darker blue color on Trulia, and that's not good. Ultimately you want it to be a lighter blue color. And if you look at the detail, it was like, armed assault, right? Was the first one that just something happened just within a week ago. And so clearly this was an area that was, not a great area to invest in terms of the vacancy. I'm not saying it was a bad area to invest in. It could be actually a good investment for somebody who is very familiar with the risks, who's comfortable with those risks. But for a lot of the students, in our course, they're not going for those types of properties, and therefore, but the way you calculate that in your cash on cash calculations is that you have to estimate a very high vacancy, because that's what's typically going to be happening in these neighborhoods, and that's going to then drop your cash on cash return, and it's not going to make the deal look as good anymore once you factor in the correct vacancy.
Right. So one of the downsides is that there may be a higher vacancy rate, and often there is a higher vacancy rate. You're also probably going to have less likelihood of a market appreciation. Again, we don't bet on market appreciation, but if it's in a rougher neighborhood with high crime, the odds are less that you're going to have any sort of market appreciation. So higher vacancy, lower market appreciation. So that's another potential downside. I
might even say there's going to be less forced appreciation too, because the question is, can you really count on, like, if I'm an investor looking at somebody else's property, and let's say they've increased the rent significantly, they've increased the net operating income, I would still worry about that vacancy, right? And so as an investor, I might discount their increased income that they've kind of generated, increased rents. I might discount that with a higher vacancy rate, and it may just ultimately nullify everything they've done. And therefore, I kind of question whether or not you even get that forced appreciation as an investor buying a property in an area like that.
So then the last question is, can I live with the downside? And I think that's actually one of the strengths of the cash and cash calculator is actually you can build in the downsides. Let's say you put in 20% vacancy. Can you live with that cash on cash return? Are you willing to deal with that? And if the answer is no, well, now you have your decision. And so that's part of I think the strength of the cash on cash calculator. It really keeps you honest to look at the potential downside situations. If you run, the different scenarios, right? And we always do this with properties. Like we have our property manager saying, yeah, you can rent this property at this much per month. If we don't quite believe it, we run different scenarios with our cash and cash calculator to look at, the best case scenario, certainly, but the worst case scenario too, and make sure we can live with that.
Yeah, for sure.